Russell has been at the center of my work for the last 5 years, pretty much full time. He was, of course, something of a Renaissance person in the true and proper sense of that term, and wrote with a reasonable degree of expertise on all of those areas. The one that concerns me tonight is a kind of connected pair of themes in his life and work. On the one side, world government, and on the other side, education. And in his view, you could not separate the two. And he thought that it was quite inconceivable that we would ever get to the stage of having a world government unless it was preceded by a long period of very profound educational reform. And as a result of that educational reform, people with a certain sort of character would be produced. His view was that if you had a significant proportion of the world's population educated in the way that he proposed, world government would become inevitable. My impression from the World Federalist Movement, and I've looked at the website, is that the movement is proceeding by political means, by trying to persuade individuals and groups in various national jurisdictions that world government would be nice. And Russell would be pretty impatient with you for that. His view would be that that's too superficial and pays too much lip service and takes too seriously the national interests and the patriotic tendencies of people in nation states as they are. Russell would have said, I really don't care what you think about nation states. They're bad things. Let's pass on and get serious about education and the reform of human nature and of character. So I've given you really I've snuck in two arguments here. One is that he was in favor of education first, world government later, and second, his view that politics was not exactly a waste of time, but that you should go right to the jugular, right to the point, and say that we face annihilation, and that therefore world government ought to be organized, accepted, and implemented immediately. He was born in 1872 in Wales, so he could claim to be a Welshman if he really wanted to, and indeed he died in Wales. He was the grandson of Lord Russell, the first Lord Russell, the great Reform Prime Minister who was central to the passage of the 1832 Reform Act. His liberality and his democracy, his democratic views, were far more important to him than his aristocratic privilege. One of the things I want to say about his life very quickly, just right now, before I go through the last stages of it, is how frequently he traveled. It has something to do with his world view, that he spent so much time on the boat or on trains, and ultimately on planes. In 1896, having married Alice Pearsall Smith, who was an American Quaker, he visited the United States, the first of many, many such visits. Lectured at Harvard in 1914, then no longer could go to the United States because his passport was lifted and so on as a result of his pacifist activities in World War I. Found himself back in the United States again frequently in the late 1920s. Spent 1920, 21 in China. I'm not sure about this, but I believe he may have given a talk on the nuclear threat in the 50s in Vancouver. I'm not sure about that, though. I actually forget. It's hard to know everything about Bertrand Russell, let me tell you. The travels take him absolutely all over Europe, most of North America at various times. He spent most of the year in Australia at one point. So he's been around the world, I don't know how many times, by 1950, back when it was relatively hard to make that kind of journey. And maybe the most crucial of these trips are the American ones, and that trip of 1920-21 to China, preceded by a 3-month stay in Russia in the early days of totalitarian communist government. This had quite an impact on his views about government, world government, and education. That one single experience. He went with a relatively open mind, in fact, something of an optimist, He had become a socialist, a rootin' tootin' socialist, during World War I, and remained one until he died. So he was sympathetic to the proposition that Russia might in fact be a relatively advanced, although poverty-stricken, democratic socialist entity. It turned out, of course, that it wasn't democratic and wasn't really socialist either. So he was enormously disappointed and terrified by the tremendous power of the apparatus of state. For him, academic freedom, freedom of thought, and intellectual independence were absolutely central values, and his experience in Russia proved to him beyond any reasonable doubt that one of the worst threats on all of those fronts is the very existence of nation states. The four stages of Russell's views on world government connected now to his life. In 1900, Russell was living in England. He'd come back from his quick trip to the United States with his wife, his first wife, one of many to come. So he was living with Alice in a little town and held a fellowship at Cambridge University at this moment. He kept that fellowship from 1895 to early 1916, when he was suspended from it for his pacifist activities. In 1900, he was living at Cambridge, a fellow at Trinity College. Early in the year, he began to hear stories about the Boer War. Now, as a liberal, he was not very happy about the British Empire anyway. On the other hand, he owned something like £35,000 personally of stock in companies that relied on imperial preferential trade. One of his activities in 1900 was to begin to sell that stock, because he so disapproved of the empire, and above all, he disapproved of its militaristic, aggressive, and murderous tendencies in South Africa. So he began to sell off the stock, and in the end, by 1914, he has sold all of it and given all of that money to virtuous causes. By virtue, he meant humanistic, agnostic, liberal, increasingly socialistic, and devoted above all to participatory and democratic political life in the United Kingdom. Though the money was pretty much gone by 1914, it all started really for him in 1900 with the wake-up call of the empire going to war in South Africa. There were lots of things connected to this. One is his discovery at the same time of the nasty labor practices of imperial bureaucrats in South Africa, who had allowed massive immigration of Indian and Chinese persons who worked in the mines and kept South African industry going, often under extraordinarily unfair circumstances. And he began to get the idea that some kind of international regulation was absolutely essential if these kinds of monstrous, inhumane practices were ever to be stopped. So he wanted some kind of international agreement to regulate the movement of populations in some fair way, regulate international labor standards, and do something about the horrible working conditions and living conditions of people in the mines, on the streets, and in the shops, in this particular case of Africa, but really in the end everywhere in the world. Phase two is probably the most striking one. Russell, of course, was a privileged man. In 1914, he would have been, a middle-aged man, I suppose we would say. By early 20th century standards, he was getting on. Well established. He had by this time published Principles of Mathematics and the 3 volumes of Principia Mathematica, which many people will say is a foundational text in the development of analytical philosophy in the Western world. He met Edward Grey, a liberal politician and the foreign minister of the UK, one day in the park, Regent's Park, and said to Lord Grey, "Well, how are things going?" And Lord Grey said, "Not too well. It's early 1914, haven't you noticed?"